This is the story of American freedom. And so, in 1988, the first President Bush was elected. And it was a limitless horizon that lay before America. The economy was booming. Americans were prosperous. With the collapse of the Soviet Union, there lay the chance of bringing American democracy to Russia, the lands of Eastern Europe, and a free market economy. In the first Gulf War, many believed that the ghost of Vietnam had finally been laid to rest by our victory. Yet, President Bush was old, and we wanted youth, and thus President Clinton was elected. William Jefferson Clinton. He gloried in that middle name. He began his trip to the inauguration with a speech at Monticello. He was a man of the people, a product of that student generation of radicals, but now in power. And the country prospered all through his 2 terms. Indeed, it is no exaggeration to say that if President Clinton could run today, he would win. Oh, his lack of judgment in some areas brought the country to a constitutional crisis. But we survived, and he survived. And by the year 2000, we were indeed the world's absolute superpower and prosperous. Why, we'd even managed to balance the budget by some means or another. But you know, it is exactly when a nation is at its height that a leader must exhibit the most important attribute of leadership, and that is foresight. Foresight. Already in the 5th century BC, the profound Greek historian Thucydides said that foresight was the most critical attribute of a great leader. And foresight is the ability to see a problem before it becomes a problem, and to solve it with a solution that is good in both the short and the long term. A good example is the atomic bomb. It was the good short-term solution to the war with Japan. And yet, for years thereafter, including right now, we stand on the verge of nuclear destruction as nuclear weapons proliferate around the world. So foresight. Foresight should have seen that the energy situation needed bold solutions. Richard Nixon had reached out to China. Oh, for generations, American business has wanted to get itself into the markets of China. We little suspected that China would become our strongest competitor, an economic power as strong as we are. That China would come to own a major part of our national debt. And that China, which has always seen itself as the center of the world, was not willing to recognize American hegemony. That China would continue to build a powerful, well-armed army. Its nuclear weapons begin about a program of naval expansion. and show itself able to buy up the most important commodities in the world. So China, the danger that it posed. Foresight, already under the first President Bush, with the collapse of the Soviet Union, it should have been understood and acted upon that communism could not collapse without some important new means of bringing prosperity to the Russian people and giving them an economically viable base for democracy. This was not done. And all through this period, Russia remained and remains deeply bitter at the failure of the United States to step in with some new form of Marshall Plan that would have rebuilt its economy. And Russia feels the deepest humiliation at the loss of its empire. Russia has always been chauvinistic and xenophobic. That chauvinism and xenophobia is still there. If you will walk the streets of Moscow or St. Petersburg or a small Russian village, speak Russian, have a few drinks of vodka, and the ordinary Russian will speak his mind that Russia under Vladimir Putin must be great again. And Iran and the whole rise of Islamic fundamentalism and an understanding of the bitter anti-Americanism, the hatred that lies at the heart of this Islamic fundamentalist revival. A revival which has carried us now to sweeping revolts all over the Middle East and will lead, I promise you, to a united Arab nation under fundamentalist Islamic rule. The terrorism, already at the millennium, the American government sent out warnings to travelers about an Osama bin Laden and a group that might plot terrorist attacks. But this too was allowed to grow and fester. That foresight was lacking. So it was when the second President Bush was elected in 2000. We did indeed stand at an apex of power. But with these deep forces threatening that power. And within 9 months, these forces had struck. And an American public was again horrified. How could this attack, the death of thousands of Americans, come about? Where was our national security? Where was the leadership to foresee this? And yes, in the days that followed, President Bush rallied the nation, presented a strong and forceful presence. But by the end of his term, he had failed. He had failed in a way as tragic as that of Lyndon Johnson. It was a failure brought about by a resolute and willingness on the part of President Bush and his advisors to ignore the lessons of history, to ignore the past, to believe that with all of our technology, we are above those lessons. And thus began the wars in the Middle East. Now, it may well be argued by later historians that had President Bush, on the day after 9/11, invaded Iraq, he would have had the full force of the support of much of the world behind him. American troops would, as they did, sweep through Iraq, go on into Iran, rightfully arguing that Iran was the center of these plots against America, strongly stating again our absolute support of Israel and our determination to do everything in support of Israel. But first, we struck in Afghanistan, unwilling to learn from the example of the Soviets and of every nation since Alexander the Great, that Afghanistan is not going to welcome anybody as a liberator. It hates everybody but Afghans, and it is impossible to conquer. And then a war in Iraq. As in Afghanistan, topple the government of Saddam Hussein, but have ready a strong, authoritarian, but just ruler to put in place. But the war dragged on and on and on. And we became absolutely sunk in a quagmire in the Middle East. And again, the press turned. Oh, at first they liked going around embedded with the troops, but they turned. They began to question this war. And the American people began to question the war. Now, it did not lead to the divisiveness of Vietnam because we were using a professional army, brave and true, men and women fighting side by side. But President Bush could not explain why we were in these lands or what our exit strategy was. What were we going to do to get out? Now, why? Because of a fundamental mistake that is taught by the lessons of history. Freedom is not a universal value. I have called this course America's Story of Freedom. And America's story of freedom is unique. Freedom. Many countries at many times have rejected the idea of freedom for the perceived benefits of authoritarian rule. I state this boldly. The nations of the Middle East, with the exception of Israel, have never known freedom. They do not want our kind of freedom. They reject it absolutely. Going back to the Epic of Gilgamesh, going back to the beginnings of civilization in ancient Mesopotamia, what is Iraq today, the idea of a good ruler is a ruler chosen by God who gives to every element in society its just due. And the idea of change is not going into a ballot box, it's taking to the streets. That's exactly what they do in the Epic of Gilgamesh. Gilgamesh has become tyrannical. They riot against him and say, we want a new ruler, just as they are rioting today in Syria. Islam, that noble religion, does not proclaim democracy. The ruler is put upon the throne by God and is answerable to God alone. We should finally come to understand that our values, our concept of the freedom of the individual, these are abhorrent to the Middle East. We believe deeply in the freedom and equality of women. They look upon it as utterly wrong. Our society is pornography to them. They don't want our values. They don't want our democracy. And now it should be clear to anyone, they don't want us. So President Bush was utterly wrong. He believed in this ideal of universal freedom. His second inaugural address is a panegyric to freedom. He says it is the universal longing of the human soul. Well, he's wrong. The universal longing of the human soul is security and the ability to take care of your family and to live under your traditions. And the most basic concept of national freedom is you don't want to be ruled by anyone else. But not only did he end his 2 terms with a quagmire in the Middle East from which we have still not extricated ourselves, which has become only worse, but with an economy in absolute shreds. Now, the Americans of 2000, why, they believed, just as people had in 1928, there'd never be another Great Depression. There was a new economic model that made such a depression impossible. Ordinary Americans watched with glee and greed as the stock market went higher and higher and higher. There was no limit to how high it would go. Well, and the banks, they knew best. The financiers, they must know best. And these financiers and bankers, while they hired all these smart young kids who must understand what they're doing since they're young, wear strange kind of glasses, have degrees from good schools. Well, they didn't. And while talking constantly of a free market economy, President Bush and his advisors, his economic advisors, political advisors, really were dealing with and supporting an economy in which the free market was very much in the hands of the business and financial interest. I have always tried to tell my conservative friends that the Federal Reserve is the greatest tampering with the free market economy. To have the government set the rate at which money trades, that is a violation of the very foundation of a free market. And so the economic collapse came with devastating results. President Obama then came into office. His very election spoke to the legacy of Martin Luther King. It spoke to the transformation of our country into a truly multicultural and diverse country, a country in which people could come from all over the world to find a better life, who sought that individual freedom to make prosperous careers for themselves, for their children to go on to ever more prosperous careers, and that everything once again was possible for every American. And it should have been a time of hope. But priorities had to be set. And the priority that had elected President Obama was to fix the economy, to get it going again, and to get out of the Middle East. Well, it's debated whether the economy is better or not. And as for the Middle East, I just have to disagree with President Obama. That is a place you should cut your losses. As Franklin Roosevelt said, focus on America and America first. If we had withdrawn our troops from Afghanistan and Iraq on the day after President Obama was inaugurated, that would just have been a change of policy. But we stayed on in Iraq until we left in defeat, and we are still in Afghanistan, where American soldiers are being shot down by our Afghan allies. And the Middle East ablaze. And it can only be said that once again, the Middle East has proven to be the graveyard of empires. So we stand today and ask the question, whither? Well, where will the story of American freedom go? It's a question that takes us right back to the founders of this country. Right back to the question of, is the answer limited government and low taxes? Or is it of a big government? A government that will charge high taxes to give every American what some call an entitlement, others call a right. It goes right back to George Washington and Alexander Hamilton and their view of a strong national government, and to Thomas Jefferson of a very limited national government, of low taxes. It goes right back to the ideals of the progressives versus the conservatives, to the new nationalism of Teddy Roosevelt, to the new freedom of Woodrow Wilson, to the New Deal of Franklin Roosevelt, in which it was the duty of government to tax, and to tax enough so that Americans were given fundamental economic security. It goes right back to Lincoln and the idea that the government had a responsibility to provide a free college education and a free homestead to every American if they were willing to work for it. Or to the ideal, we call it conservative today, even carrying it over to the idea of libertarianism, that the government should do as little as possible. Provide for the common defense, secure contracts, have a justice system, but taxes should be as low as possible. Even back to the idea of states' rights. Jefferson believed in states' rights, and he believed in the idea that we hear again today, that if a state doesn't want a law, it can simply refuse to put into effect such a law passed by the federal Congress. So those same fundamental disagreements are there. And they are deeply divisive. But there are even deeper questions. We have defined national freedom as your freedom from foreign domination, political freedom as your freedom to vote and to hold office, individual freedom as your freedom to live as you choose, as long as you harm no one else. Well, our national freedom is gravely in danger, and it is in danger from the national debt. The debt has proven the ruin of every nation in history. Our nation could be brought to its knees by a failure to solve this debt and to get our country out of debt to hostile foreign powers and to balance our budget. Our political freedom, I worry deeply about it. Our politics are corrupt. Partisan politics have brought our entire congressional system to gridlock. The most pressing issues cannot be solved because one party would rather see itself triumph over the other party on some petty matter than to work together to solve these grave problems. And individual freedom. What does it mean? We proclaim to the world life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Well, don't take those as cliches. Right now, the moral issue that is so divisive, we are afraid to even talk about it as a nation is, when does life begin? After all, the Confederates believed it was their right to own property in humans. A later generation may look back upon us and proclaim us to be hypocrites, calling ourselves a liberal democracy and not allowing every life to flourish. Liberty, our freedom to live as we choose. To what degree is that influenced by modern technology? Just as the very concept of life is challenged by the technology to clone. Technology, your ability to go on the internet, FaceNet, Twitter. Who knows what will be out there by the time even these lectures are streamed out. The streaming out of these lectures. Oh, yes, it gives you a chance to tell everybody where you are all the time, as though they care. And yet, it gives to government the ability to collect every scintilla of information about you. Yes, Facebook enables the Arab Spring to flourish. And yet at the same time, much of what appears on Facebook is nothing but the chatter of the mob that we have heard since the beginning of history, without any notion of truth and the pursuit of happiness. We have put aside Franklin Roosevelt's idea of returning to old and precious values. We live in a world in which we are utterly uncertain of those values. And we live in a world in which Americans are utterly consumed with themselves and with greed. and the ideal of Thomas Jefferson that we should sacrifice to leave the world a better place is no longer fundamental to our core beliefs. But I think that you can either believe that things are due to chance or that there is a deeper meaning to history. And I reflect that at every moment in our country's history that has been critical, great leaders have emerged. The galaxy of statesmen we call the founders, Abraham Lincoln, Franklin Roosevelt, Ronald Reagan. And I believe that there is somewhere in this great country a leader who again can appeal to all that is best in the American people. That there are still men and women who want to be elected to Congress, not for the salary, not for partisan politics, but to do what is best for this country. And I still believed that our society, that Americans are the best, the most magnanimous, the most willing to forgive, the most willing to follow the light once they are shown that light than any nation in history. And that we still have a great destiny to fulfill, and that, as Franklin Roosevelt said, this great nation will endure as it has endured, it will revive, and it will prosper.
The Story of Freedom in America with Dr. J. Rufus Fears is made possible by the generous support of our Freedom and Heritage sponsors. The Story of Freedom in America is a program of the Institute for the American Constitutional Heritage at the University of Oklahoma, in partnership with the Alumni Association of the University of Oklahoma. For more videos and podcasts, visit freedom.ou.edu.